Good morning, everybody. I want to start by thanking David, who just disappeared. I would say from January through July, he eats, lives, breathes, and thinks PBL world. And he greets me in the morning as I arrive with, what do you think if we, or I had a great idea last night. And this is a third year of PBL world, bigger, better. More people than we've ever had. We have over 650 this week, more offerings, and it's all because of him. So I want us to raise a hand for David. This keynote is going to be different than the others in two ways. It's going to be much shorter. And it's going to be a little more reflective. We've had a lot of inspirational people talking this week, and I've left with some new visions of what kids can do and what teachers can do. But my role here is to talk a little bit about a concept that we've been working on, thinking through for the last 6 to 9 months. And this is the idea of setting out a PBL gold standard. Now, this began with some discussion among the board as we were doing our strategic planning process. And by the way, I want to acknowledge the board sitting up front, terrorizing me as they look at me. But the board continues to provide important thinking, input, and guidance. And it was through a board strategic plan led by Ken Kay, that we conceived the idea of the gold standard. The concern was this: PBL is in again, and there are a lot of people doing things that they're calling PBL. But is this really what is going on? Would you really want your own children doing it? Do you think it's a good use of their time? Would you really want to take valuable classroom time and spend it? Well, obviously, if it's quality, you do. But if it's just messing about, you don't. So what distinguishes messing about and rigorous, thoughtful, well-organized PBL? Is there a gold standard? That would be aspirational. Doesn't mean every time you're in a class, you're achieving the gold standard. This is probably not a gold standard keynote. But I can aspire to it being a gold standard keynote. And so we wanted that the definition be something that people would want to achieve and get better at. We wanted an inclusive definition. Yesterday, we had our partners from different deeper learning network schools. They all share the same basic philosophy, but they do things differently, and they emphasize different things. And we wanted to bring them here so that they could show off their signature practices so that people could learn to do the things that they do really well. So a definition has to be inclusive rather than exclusive. We're not trying to create the elite. We're trying to raise the sea as a whole. It should be empirically based. There's been a lot of research that's occurred over the last 30 years in PBL, a lot of thinking, a lot of theorizing. We ought to draw on what researchers have told us and what practitioners have told us. What do we know that is successful, that is best practices in the classroom? And finally, it needs to be vetted by the community. That is, we need to put some ideas out there and then get input, feedback, critique, our own critical friends protocol, so to speak, about these ideas. So this is the beginning of a community process of vetting an idea. I'm going to put forth my best thinking as reflected by going through 30, 40 years of research literature, talking to staff, talking to teachers. And over the next 6 to 9 months, there'll be a process of critique and revision. You'll be invited. We're going to set up a special section on the website. We've established a Twitter hashtag. We'll be having some face-to-face meetings. So at the end of this talk, I hope that some new thoughts about what a gold standard might be. I've mentioned that what we wanted to build on, what we've learned over the last 15 years of doing PBL. We work with about 12,000, 14,000 teachers a year, and we learn from what they tell us. We learn from our fellow travelers committed to PBL, especially those in the Deeper Learning Network, and I want to do a shout out to their continuing evolution and good work. And finally, our research findings on PBL. Well, when I was given this task by the board, it was like catnip. It allowed me to release my inner nerd. Here's a graduation picture of myself in college when I had a little more hair. And to delve into new and old writing about PBL. And I found some fascinating things. I found, for example, the claim, and this would be an interesting project to assess this claim, that PBL began in the Renaissance. It started when architects were being trained in the traditional didactic method in Italy, revolted. They said, this isn't the way you learn to build buildings. We want to build models. We want to go do apprenticeships. We don't want to sit there and be lectured at. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but it's certainly an interesting thought that, PBL goes back to the 15th century. I found the first book written about PBL called The Project Method, written by William Hurd Kilpatrick, who was a professor at Teachers College, Columbia. And it was written in 1918. And he was very excited about the possibilities of students being engaged in wholehearted, purposeful activity. That was his definition of PBL. Well, that caused some problems because people pointed out that engagement is not necessarily learning. And you might be engaged in a wholehearted activity, but it might not lead to learning. And his mentor, actually, John Dewey, was very concerned about this. And I know we all, and we've done it at BIE, sort of genuflect to John Dewey and call him the godfather of PBL, and this is where it all began. But when you dig a little and see what Dewey really said about PBL, it's a little different. He said, and this is a quote from Democracy in Education, "The danger that children undertaking too complex projects will just muddle and mess," don't you love it? Muddle and mess is a minor matter. But the danger that they acquire crude standards is an important matter. Take that, E.D. Hirsch. John Dewey is the first leader of the standards movement. It is the fault of the teacher if the student does not perceive the inadequacy of his performances. Dewey was calling for rigor. He was calling for teachers working with students so they learn and understand what is quality learning. If Ron Berger were here, he'd probably be doing cartwheels. So I plowed, and I had a great time doing it. And I came back to our icon, the essential elements, which we put out in 2010 after much internal discussion. And I know everyone who's been here this week probably has that indelibly engraved on their brain. And indeed, it has been the center of our work, and I think in many ways it's been one reason why our message seems to resonate with people. And I asked myself about each of those categories. And pretty much, I think we hit it right. I think that those are good descriptors of what PBL well done is like. But I had a few changes I wanted to propose. I have a few changes. And one has to do with our thinking about inquiry. As you probably remember, that element is called in-depth inquiry. And I think what that leaves out is a realization that students need to work over time on inquiry. This is not a 45-minute, let's look deeply into something. This is a project which lasts over days, maybe over weeks, maybe over months, and has enough room for kids to have some difficulties, surmount the difficulties, raise questions, answer them. So I'm proposing that we keep the same concepts, but call it sustained inquiry rather than in-depth inquiry. The other problematic element that I saw was need to know. And I don't know if this has been a confusion with this group, but it's certainly been a confusion in past groups. And that it's confused with the technique we talk about of the need to know technique, putting up on the board needs to knows, and then answering them as you go through the project. I mean, does this mean we say a project has to begin with a need to know list? Obviously, that's silly. That's a good way to begin, but it's not the only way. And the concept is kind of squishy. You know, it's basically motivation. It's basically engagement, and everything else has to do with a description of the project, not what you want the project to achieve. So I took off need to know, or I proposed taking off need to know. And Sam, I'm sorry you're not here, but after 3 years, I am convinced, I am a believer, that authenticity ought to be called out as a key definition of PBL. So I'm suggesting the revision, including authentic tasks instead of a need to know. And John Larmer has told us what it means to be authentic. It means meeting a need beyond the classroom, or a project that is relevant to students' lives, a realistic scenario, engaging tools and tasks used by professionals. So I think that's a pretty good starting definition. Maybe it can be improved, but that's what authenticity means to us. So now we have sort of a golded up essential elements. Project design, all focus on project design elements. But you know what they leave out? They leave out you. They leave out the implementation. They leave out what actually happens in the classroom. And you know that the teacher is key to effective project-based learning. But I ran out of real estate. So what do? I liked all the other elements. I didn't want to change them. So then I started zeroing in on the center. And I thought, now why do we have significant content in 21st century competencies? Well, we have it because that's the goal of a project. And we also have it because in 2010, you would not be sitting here. We were not a movement at that point. We were a voice. And we wanted to call out that PBL was not muddle and mess, was not messing about. It was about learning significant content, and it was about achieving 21st century skills. We still believe that, but we don't think that we have to cry quite as loudly about that, because at this point, 21st century competencies and the Common Core are part of the national dialogue. They're here. And that gave me some room. And it gave me some room to come back to the teacher and think about what project-based teaching, not student learning, but what project-based teaching entails. And I'm not entirely sure, but I took inspiration from John Hattie's incredible empirical work, over 800 meta-analyses over 15 years of what makes a difference in student learning. And the things that Hattie calls out, among other things, he says, let's start with a positive relationship with students. This predicts achievement, and it sort of sets the stage for everything else that happens in the classroom. And let's focus on a growth mindset. That is, you're getting better at things. You're learning to accomplish things through effort. This is not a classroom where you come in with a certain ability and you leave with a certain ability. But learning happens over the course of the year. And the The D's, for any fellow nerds out there, are the effect sizes that Hattie found for these particular instructional aspects. You set clear goals with challenging tasks and give students feedback that they can use to get better. You model thinking and you teach metacognitive strategies. And most importantly, what Hattie calls feedback and speaks of it as a two-way process. You monitor what's going on, you assess whether students are reaching the goals of the project, and you revise as necessary, providing feedback so they can get there. You're scaffolding all the time, walking around, talking to groups, seeing how they're doing, listening to their conversations, asking for a class report on how the project is going, asking for individual reports. You're monitoring the progress. You're not just leaving kids to muddle and mess. So this is what I wound up with. And this is what I would like to propose for rigorous critique and feedback. Oh, sorry. I forgot an element. The last one was effective learning teams. And I had a moment of sort of a crise de conscience last night as I was thinking about Cindy's presentation yesterday. I guess it was, yeah, the movie, in which she talked about structured collaboration as being a key aspect of PBL. I couldn't agree more. And maybe that's a better way to phrase it. I don't know. That's what the next year is to talk about. How do we get as crisp as possible in describing what we're talking about? But you know, what that includes, at least in my mind, is planning, goal setting, task and self-management that's going on in a group, a team, shared ideas and extended discussion, divergent and convergent thinking, a universal contribution, no free riders, and a leadership that shifts with the task. So these need to be sort of thought through and fleshed out, but clearly teams or structured collaboration is a fundamental aspect of PBL. That's how you learn the collaboration skills, that's how you learn the self-management, that's how you learn to argue respectfully your point of view. So here we are. This is going to go into the wild for comment. We've established a hashtag for comment on it. There will be a place on our site. And I really look forward to learning from you and from many others like you over the next 6 months and making this something, hopefully, that will be useful, not just to people in this room, but to people all over the world that are trying to do project-based learning. All right, so do me this favor, send me your ideas. It's only 140 characters. You know, shoot it down, lift it up, just tell me what you think. So I'd now like to turn, I guess I'm turning it over to David. David?